Welcome back to your CoC 201 training. This training is focused on the CoC NOFA once again. We're going to be focusing on the priority list piece of the NOFA, which includes your renewals, your new projects, and your ranking. The last module talked about the CoC consolidated application, which is kind of part one of the CoC NOFA process. And part two is all about your projects that you're prioritizing through your CoC NOFA competition. This includes your renewal projects, your new projects, and also what is your process for ranking. So let's dive in. So the CoC must submit a priority list to HUD. And basically what this means is that individual projects must also submit their own applications to the CoC for inclusion on the priority list. So projects that are seeking to renew their grants are renewal projects. They must go through an evaluation process, and the CoC uses objective criteria to score renewal projects as part of the CoC NOFA competition. The CoC must also rank all projects, both renewal and new. Those ranked on the bottom may lose funding or not receive new funding. The CoC can also choose to reallocate projects. These are projects that the CoC is choosing not to renew, and the funds are directed to another use. That can be a full reallocation or a partial reallocation, so you're not funding the project at all, or you're funding it at a reduced level. And reallocations can also be voluntary. So if an organization decides they don't want to operate their project anymore, the CoC can basically take that money back and use it for another purpose. And we noted about new projects. The CoC can choose to fund new projects. In a previous module, we talked about the CoC bonus funding, as well as the CoC domestic violence bonus funding. So there's different ways throughout the NOFA competition for the CoC to create new projects. All of these projects, again, are included on the priority list and have to be ranked. So there is a project review period. So again, all those projects have to submit an application to the CoC, and the CoC reviews all those project applications to make sure they're meeting HUD requirements. So the system we use to submit our CoC application to HUD is called eSnaps. So all the individual projects submit an application in eSnap, and then the CoC reviews them. So new projects have to be carefully reviewed because HUD has threshold requirements that are required in order for new projects to be funded. So when the CoC goes in and reviews these applications, we're really looking to make sure that it passes HUD thresholds and also that it matches the activities that the CoC approved. And then for renewal projects, we are specifically looking for anything that might hold up a project in contracting. So we're reviewing the application saying, is this going to pass muster with HUD? Is there anything in this application that maybe doesn't match up? And also we want to make sure the project continues to follow CoC priorities. So let's talk about new projects. So the new project process is different than the renewal process. So if new project funding is available, the CoC will release a new project solicitation or RFP, request for proposals. So the new funding is available through the HUD CoC bonus, whether that's the regular CoC bonus, or in the past couple of years, we've also had a domestic violence specific bonus, or sometimes funding is available through reallocating existing projects. So funds can be used either for completely new projects or can be used to expand existing projects. Before a new project solicitation is released, it's generally recommended that CoCs go through a process to determine what the priorities for a new project. In the Western PA CoC, typically the CoC does a gaps analysis, which looks at what is the demand for services in our CoC, what do folks need, how many folks are coming to the CoC for services, and then what inventory do we have, and how do those match up? Are there key gaps in certain areas that we should try to fill through the CoC new project process? So then that new project solicitation is drafted, reviewed, and released. And we try to distribute it as widely as possible. So HUD wants CoCs to really demonstrate that you're open to new agencies as applicants. You may have had the same organizations coming in for funding year over year, which is fine because often those organizations might have expertise, but you also need to ensure that you're engaging new organizations who may be able to serve maybe a different population of folks, or they have a different expertise. So once we get the new project applications, they're reviewed and then applicants are selected. And in the Western PA CoC, this process is done by the funding committee. Again, we mentioned this in a previous module. The funding committee is made up of non-conflicted members, so folks who do not get CoC funding. So they really come at this with sort of a neutral lens on the projects. And then once the project applications are selected, so we decide which new projects the CoC wants to go for, those projects complete a full application in eSNAPS. So we talked about new projects. Now for renewal projects, CoCs must rank all projects for the priority list, including new and renewal. And for the Western PA CoC, PA 601, I mentioned on our acronyms earlier that PA 601 is our HUD code for the Western PA CoC. The ranking of renewal projects, so those who are seeking to renew their funding, is assisted through scoring those projects using a common set of criteria. So each year the CoC will evaluate projects that are renewals using a set of objective criteria that's very data driven to determine, who had high performance in the past year, who had more challenging performance, and that helps inform the ranking. And the criteria really reflects items that HUD and the CoC prioritize. HUD is very clear that you need to have objective criteria, so data-driven criteria. And there's also other areas that the CoC may prioritize that can be integrated into the ranking. HUD does award a considerable number of points on the CoC application for how your CoC does your scoring and ranking process. So it's really important. And the goal is to have an open, fair, transparent process. We mentioned in a previous module about the tier 1 and tier 2 split, how tier 1 projects are kind of your safe projects, and tier 2 projects are the ones you have to compete for. So the CoC has to have a way of determining which projects go into tier 1 and which go into tier 2. So the scoring and ranking is how this is determined. And there's a mix of projects that end up being ranked. You have your renewal projects, your new projects, your HMIS grant, your coordinated entry grants. Everything is ranked except the planning grant. So the process for renewal project scoring that the CoC follows is, first, the renewal scoring criteria is approved by the funding committee. The funding committee updates the criteria every year. The funding committee actually does an analysis of how did projects score last year? Was there anything that we need to tweak or adjust? Things like that. Once the scoring criteria is approved, the CoC explains to grantees what the process is going to be and how to submit their info for scoring. So agencies have to submit certain info to the CoC to help with scoring. The CoC also gathers data from other sources, so HMIS data, RAB participation, things like that. We score the projects, we release the preliminary scores, and then there's an appeals opportunity. So each grantee can review their scoring and say, is there anything in here that I need to appeal? Maybe there was an extenuating circumstance. Maybe there's something that the grantee thinks is an error. So we give time for folks to submit appeals. Then the appeals are reviewed by the funding committee, and the funding committee makes a decision about whether to grant that appeal or not, and then the grantees are notified. And finally, this culminates in a final scores being released. Typically, this process is happening over a couple of months. Typically, it might happen either during the NOFA or before the NOFA. This is a lot to get done during that typically 90-day NOFA period. So trying to do this as soon as possible during the NOFA helps make sure that the process goes smoothly. And all this information ends up being posted online. HUD requires that CoCs have an open and transparent scoring process. So all this information is shared via email with grantees, and we do end up posting it online as well. We've mentioned reallocation a couple times. So reallocation is a process that CoCs use to shift funds in whole or part from existing renewal projects to create one or more new projects. Basically, you keep the money from the reallocated project and can use it for another source. And it's basically, in other words, the process by which funds are taken from one project to be used for a new project. So CoCs can basically reclaim funding from renewal projects through reallocation. And HUD encourages reallocation. HUD wants CoCs to look at any projects that maybe are demonstrating poor performance or failing to meet CoC standards and use that money more effectively. Sometimes an agency will undergo a voluntary reallocation. Typically, this is when they're maybe not interested in operating the project due to certain barriers, or maybe they actually want to switch their project altogether. They want to, switch from being a permanent supportive housing to a rapid rehousing provider. So they'll reallocate their grant and then go in for a new project. So CoCs can really set their ground rules about reallocation through their funding policies, but generally you might reallocate funds when a project is demonstrating poor performance, an agency has underspending, so they're failing to spend down money and that money has to go back to HUD, or if projects are no longer aligned with the needs or priorities of the CoC. And depending on the circumstances of the reallocation, sometimes you may end up putting out a new project solicitation to say, hey, we're reallocating, we have reallocated money in this community, and we want folks to come in for it. So again, just to recap, reallocation can be partial or full. A full reallocation is when you take 100% of the project's funds back to use for another purpose. And a partial is when you might reclaim only a portion of the funds. Maybe a grant has consistent underspending. So you're going to shave off the amount of money that has consistently been underspent. In terms of the scoring and ranking, once the CoC has scored renewal projects, determined reallocations, and selected new projects, then you move forward on the project ranking. So the project ranking determines what order your projects are going to be in on the priority list. And projects are basically numbered from 1 to however many projects you have. And then the projects end up being in either tier 1 or tier 2. There is a strategy in ranking that HUD kind of lays out. So DMA works with the funding committee with the goal of trying to retain as much money for the CoC as possible. And new projects can actually be ranked in either tier 1 or tier 2. And the CoC's priorities are really important. They really drive how you're ranking projects on that priority list. In terms of who does what and NOFA responsibilities, there are certain key players that play a key role: funding committee, non-conflicted members of the governing board, the board, and the RABs. So let's just touch on who does what. So in the Western PA CoC, the funding committee is charged with updating that renewal scoring criteria and finalizing the scoring for renewal projects. The funding committee makes recommendations related to full or partial reallocation. The funding committee reviews new project solicitations and how to score new projects, reviews the new projects applications and approves or denies them. The funding committee reviews appeals. So there's different appeals opportunities that new projects can do if they're not selected. Renewal projects can do appeals related to their scoring. And if there's an involuntary reallocation, those folks can also appeal. So the funding committee will review appeals. And then finally, we'll determine the ranking of all the renewal and new projects. The non-conflicted members of the governing board, basically these are governing board members who do not get CoC funds. So they kind of are the second tier of review after the funding committee. So the non-conflicted members of the governing board help establish priorities for funding projects with input from CoC members and the gaps analysis. The non-conflicted members of the governing board approve the new project RFP, application, and scoring tool. They approve the revised annual scoring criteria. They review and approve recommendations related to partial or full reallocation. And then if an appeal is denied by the funding committee around reallocation, there'll be a second level of review. So the non-conflicted governing boards are really in charge of kind of being that second layer of approvals for certain areas of the scoring process. The CoC board plays an oversight role, making sure that this process is moving forward and is done in a collaborative way. And the CoC board also provides input on how the CoC planning grant funds are used. And lastly, the RABs. The RABs provide input on the renewal scoring criteria. Typically, after the scoring is concluded, there'll be a chance for grantees to give feedback on anything that they think should be changed for the future year. And the funding committee does take that into consideration and make adjustments. And then the RABs also provide input for prioritizing the region's needs. So what is DCED's job? You know that by now that DCED is the collaborative applicant for the CoC. So the DCED actually has a lot of responsibilities for the NOFA process. And one thing I'll note is that DCED contracts out the NOFA related tasks to DMA. So most of these tasks listed here, DMA as the consultant for the CoC is taking the lead on moving these pieces forward. So for the CoC NOFA, DCED/DMA support the board and the funding committee. They support the development and implementation of policies. They conduct the actual evaluation and scoring process with input and collaboration with the funding committee. They support that new project solicitation, so writing the RFP, for example, and that selection process in collaboration with the funding committee. They also do all the eSNAPs project application reviews, so making sure those applications meet HUD threshold and cover all the bases. DCD and DMA also complete the consolidated application, so actually writing the narratives for HUD, compiling all the necessary attachments. DCD/DMA complete the priority list, apply for planning grant funds, publicly post all the application materials and ranking, and HUD has specific requirements about when things need to be posted. And lastly, they submit the application. So you have completed CoC 101 and CoC 201 training. Thank you for joining, and we hope this information has been really helpful and will help you be a more effective CoC member and really help move work forward in the CoC. Thank you again.